So let's just gently float over to the glittering, yet surprisingly stagnant court of 17th century Spain. Our main character for tonight's sleepy tale is Charles II, often called El Hechizado by his subjects. Now, El Hechizado translates to the Bewitched, which, is a pretty dramatic nickname, but honestly, when you look at the poor guy's life, you'd probably start to wonder if someone had indeed cast a spell, or if it was just, the spell of genetics gone terribly, terribly wrong. Because why not blame magic when you can't quite grasp the concept of, say, too many cousins getting married? Charles II, born in 1661, was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line, and honestly, it really does feel like the family tree just kind of gave up after him. His parents were Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. And if you're thinking, Austria? Weren't the Habsburgs Spanish? Then you've stumbled upon the very core of our problem tonight. See, the Habsburgs were like the ultimate pan-European royal dynasty. They had branches everywhere. And their solution to keeping power and titles within the family, which, is totally understandable if you're a megalomaniac monarch, was to marry within their own rather exclusive gene pool. A lot. Mariana of Austria, Charles's mother, was actually Philip IV's niece. Yes, you heard that right. His niece. But wait. It gets even more delightfully incestuous. Philip IV was also Mariana's cousin. So she was both his niece and his cousin, and Philip IV's parents were cousins too, and his grandparents were also cousins. It was like a royal wedding buffet where everyone was wearing the same family crest. At a certain point, it just becomes a game of how many ways can we be related. This, of course, led to Charles II's rather unfortunate genetic makeup. His inbreeding coefficient, which is a fancy way of saying how much genetic overlap he had, was higher than that of a child born to full siblings. Just let that sink in for a moment. He basically had the genetic diversity of a very small, very unhappy village. And the results, they weren't exactly sparkling. From the moment he arrived in the world, Charles was a bit of a struggle. He was a sickly child, unable to even speak until he was 4 years old, and he couldn't walk until he was 8. This wasn't some sort of grand philosophical stance on early childhood development, of course. It was just because his legs, bless their little royal hearts, weren't quite strong enough to support him. He suffered from rickets, a condition often caused by poor diet, but in Charles's case, it was probably just the genetic equivalent of a shrug. Meh, we tried. His tutors, bless their patient souls, tried their best. They really did. But Charles was reportedly quite slow mentally. He preferred playing with toy soldiers and perhaps contemplating the sheer absurdity of his own existence rather than engaging with matters of state, which, honestly, fair enough. If I were him, I'd probably just want to play with toys too. The weight of an entire failing empire and a truly spectacular genetic handicap? No thanks. Physically, Charles II was... he was a spectacle. He famously exhibited the Habsburg jaw, a severe prognathism where his lower jaw protruded so far that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. This meant he couldn't properly chew his food. Poor guy. And because his tongue was also reportedly quite large, he had trouble speaking clearly and often drooled. It wasn't exactly the dashing, heroic image you'd expect from a monarch, more like a perpetually confused, slightly damp potato in a crown. An ironic contrast indeed for a king who was meant to embody the glory of Spain. He was often described as having a pale complexion, a gaunt face, and just generally looking quite frail. He was prone to constant illnesses, fevers, headaches, and epileptic fits. It seemed like his body was just a constant battleground where his various organs were simply trying to stage a tiny internal coup. And of course, because this was the 17th century, the medical experts of the time had some truly magnificent ideas about what was wrong with him. They blamed everything from witchcraft to bad air, but never, ever, the blindingly obvious elephant in the royal drawing room, all those family reunions that ended in marriage. The court, of course, had to maintain appearances. They called him the Great at times, which feels like a truly sarcastic epithet, even for royalty. It was probably more out of a desperate hope that if they just said it enough, it might somehow magically become true. Because, let's be honest, Charles the mildly incapacitated, or Charles the Habsburg jawed, just doesn't quite have the same ring to it. His reign began when he was just 4 years old, with his mother, Mariana, acting as regent. This was probably a good thing because, as we've established, Charles wasn't exactly ready to tackle the complexities of running an empire. His mother was a formidable woman for a Habsburg, and she had her work cut out for her. The Spanish Empire was already in decline, struggling with economic woes, military defeats, and a general sense of, oh dear, what now? And having a sickly, developmentally delayed boy king certainly didn't help rally the troops. When Charles eventually came to age, technically, he was still very much under the influence of various regents and court factions. He was easily manipulated, which, is quite convenient if you're a power-hungry courtier. He never really asserted himself as a strong ruler. His decisions were often swayed by those around him, turning the Spanish court into a constant low-stakes game of political musical chairs, where the prize was the ear of the rather dazed king. He pretty much carved his life into a continuous exercise of being carefully managed. Every move, every public appearance, every utterance was scrutinized and, more often than not, compensated for by someone else. Imagine having to live your entire life knowing that everyone around you is just constantly trying to figure out how to make you seem less broken. It sounds exhausting, even for a monotone historian like myself.
Now, let's talk about his personal life, because that's where things get truly tragic, or perhaps just profoundly sad. Charles was married twice. Yes, twice, because, of course, the primary duty of any monarch, especially an inbred one, is to produce an heir, preferably a healthy one, if at all possible, but at least an heir. His first wife was Marie Louise of Orléans, a French princess, daughter of King Louis XIV's brother. She was brought to Spain, no doubt with the weight of an entire nation's hopes resting on her rather delicate shoulders. The expectation was simple: produce a son. A strapping, healthy, non-Habsburg-jawed son. Simple, right? Marie Louise herself was reportedly quite beautiful and lively, a stark contrast to her sickly husband. She arrived in Spain to a rather bleak and rigid court, which was probably a bit of a shock after the glittering extravagance of Versailles. And then, of course, she met Charles. Imagine that first meeting. The anticipation, the grand pronouncements, and then the drooling, barely articulate king who couldn't quite chew his dinner. It was probably less love at first sight and more, oh dear, what have I gotten myself into? Their marriage, unfortunately, was not a fruitful one. No children came, and the court, being the gossipy, politically charged environment it was, immediately started whispering. Was it her fault? Was it his? Was it the witchcraft again? Or perhaps was it the tiny, tiny gene pool? My money's on the gene pool. But because why not double down on the dramatic accusations, the witchcraft theories certainly persisted. Marie Louise, poor woman, grew increasingly depressed in the suffocating Spanish court. She found little joy, and her life was a constant cycle of pressure to conceive, followed by disappointment. She died in 1689, aged just 26, leaving Charles childless. The official cause of death was appendicitis. But given the circumstances, one can only imagine the sheer despair she must have felt. It's almost as if her body just said, you know what? I'm out. Let's just gently float over to another royal disaster in the making. Because, of course, a monarch must have an heir. So Charles was quickly married off again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a large, fertile family. The hope clearly was that perhaps her robust genetics could somehow overpower Charles's rather delicate ones. It was a long shot, to be fair, like trying to bake a perfect soufflé with a leaky oven and expired ingredients. Maria Anna was also reported that quite a strong-willed woman. She arrived with the same mission as Marie Louise, produce an heir. And she tried. Oh, how she tried, but alas, the results were the same. no children. Despite her fervent prayers, her many visits to holy relics, and presumably a lot of crossed fingers, Charles remained childless. The succession crisis of Spain was growing more and more dire, hovering over the court like a very ominous, childless thundercloud. Maria Anna, unlike her predecessor, wasn't one to wallow in despair quietly. She became heavily involved in court politics, often clashing with Charles's mother, Mariana, and other factions. She was determined to secure her own position, and if she couldn't produce an heir, she could at least try to influence who would inherit the throne after Charles, because, when your primary job is unfulfilled, you might as well find a side hustle in court intrigue. It seems like a perfectly logical career move, all things considered. The political maneuvering around Charles II's succession became incredibly intense. Spain was apprised that all the major European powers, France, Austria, and even England, coveted. The thought of the vast Spanish Empire with its American colonies and European holdings falling into the hands of one rival or another was enough to give every monarch in Europe a serious case of royal indigestion. And poor Charles, in the midst of all this, was essentially a pawn. He was constantly pressured by his various advisors, by his wife, by his mother, and by the ambassadors of foreign powers, all trying to convince him to name their candidate as his successor. Imagine the headache. If he didn't already have headaches from, everything, this certainly would have induced them. It was a never-ending parade of people whispering in his ear, trying to get him to sign a piece of paper that would determine the fate of an entire continent. His health continued to decline dramatically. He suffered from severe pain, digestive issues, and was often incapacitated. He was constantly subjected to various cures by the court physicians, which, probably just made things worse. Leeches, purges, strange concoctions. It was a veritable buffet of medieval medical malpractice. At one point, they even performed an exorcism on him because why not blame demons when you've already ruled out a robust gene pool? The poor guy really couldn't catch a break. In his later years, Charles became increasingly frail and reclusive. He rarely left his chambers, consumed by his illnesses and the immense pressure of the succession crisis. His mind, already fragile, seemed to drift further away from reality. He was a king in name, but in essence, he was a prisoner of his own failing body and the relentless demands of his lineage. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II finally, mercifully, passed away, just short of his 39th birthday. An astonishing age, given everything he went through, a testament to, something, perhaps sheer stubbornness. His autopsy, of course, was a rather gruesome affair, as autopsies were often in those days, but it confirmed what many had suspected. His internal organs were in a state of advanced decay, his brain was shrunken, and he essentially lacked any viable reproductive organs. It was a confirmation of decades of genetic misfortune, all nicely tied up with a bow of historical tragedy. His death, as you might expect, didn't bring peace to Spain. Oh no, of course not. It actually plunged Europe into one of its longest and most brutal conflicts, the War of Spanish Succession, because Charles, in his final moments, had named a French Bourbon prince as his heir, much to the fury of the Austrian Habsburgs. It was the ultimate, albeit unintentional, act of spite from a king who had suffered so much. He probably thought, I couldn't produce an heir, but I can certainly spark a continent-wide war, and he did. And so the Spanish Habsburg line ended not with the bang, but with the whimpers of a sickly king and the echoes of a continent-wide argument. Charles II of Spain remains a poignant, if slightly morbid example of what happens when a royal family decides that variety is in fact the spice of life they can simply do without. His life serves as a rather stark, if sleepy, reminder that sometimes the biggest threats to a dynasty aren't invading armies, but simply the relentless pursuit of, well, family values. Let's just gently float away from the Spanish court now and let the echoes of that long-ago succession crisis fade into the background. Because, as you can imagine, Charles II of Spain was not the only royal whose life was shaped by these rather interesting matrimonial choices. The Habsburgs, bless their hearts, were just getting started.
Our next stop on this rather slow-moving royal gene boat is Philip III of Spain. Now, Philip III was born in 1578, which means he was Charles II's great-grandfather. So you can already sense the familial connection, right? The genetic threads were already weaving themselves into a rather predictable pattern. He was also born into a time of immense power for Spain, when the empire truly did stretch, as the saying goes, where the sun never sets, which of course meant a lot of responsibility. And responsibility, as we'll see, wasn't exactly Philip's favorite hobby. Philip III was the son of the famously austere and hard-working Philip II, who, you know, was the guy who built the Escorial and tried to invade England with the Spanish Armada. So, big shoes to fill, you might say. And his mother was Anna of Austria. And just so we're all clear on the Habsburg family dynamics, Anna of Austria was Philip II's niece. Yes, again, with the nieces. It was practically the Habsburg family motto, if in doubt, marry your niece. It certainly simplified the guest list for weddings, I suppose. So, from the very beginning, Philip III carried a significant amount of that concentrated Habsburg DNA. While he didn't suffer from the extreme physical deformities of Charles II, he certainly inherited some of the family's more delicate constitution. He was often described as being somewhat weak and melancholic, prone to bouts of ill health, which, for a king, is less than ideal. You really want your monarch to be, robust, at least in appearance. But where Philip III truly shone, or perhaps didn't shine, was in his temperament. Unlike his stern, workaholic father, Philip II, Philip III was, to put it mildly, not a fan of governance. He preferred leisure and piety. A lot of piety, actually. He was deeply religious, spending vast amounts of time on prayers, religious ceremonies, and generally trying to appease the heavens, which, is admirable in a personal capacity, less so when you're supposed to be running one of the largest empires in the world. His solution to this rather inconvenient problem of governing was quite simple. Delegate everything. He effectively handed over the reins of power to his favorite courtier, Francisco Gómez de Sandoval, Duke of Lerma. Lerma became what's known as a valido, or favorite, essentially running the show while Philip busied himself with more divine pursuits. Or perhaps just, enjoying himself. This was a pretty dramatic shift from his father, who micromanaged everything from his desk. Philip III, on the other hand, was more of a macro delegator. As in, I delegate the macro-level governing to you, while I focus on this rather interesting new rosary. The Duke of Lerma, of course, was delighted with this arrangement. He accumulated immense wealth and power, building himself a magnificent palace and basically becoming the de facto ruler of Spain. This wasn't exactly a meritocracy, mind you. Lerma was skilled at pleasing the king, and that seemed to be his primary qualification, which, again, for an empire of Spain's magnitude, is a somewhat concerning management strategy. But hey, the king was happy and pious. So, priorities. Philip III's personal life was also marked by this somewhat detached approach. He married Margaret of Austria.
yet another Habsburg. Because, you can never have too many Habsburgs in the family tree. Margaret was actually his first cousin once removed. So just slightly further afield than his mother and father, but still definitely keeping it in the same genetic postcode. Margaret was reportedly much more active and intelligent queen than Philip was a king. She was also deeply religious, which, was a good match for Philip. But unlike her husband, she also took an interest in matters of state and tried to influence policy. She was often at odds with the Duke of Lerma, seeing him as a corrupting influence and a drain on the royal treasury, which, honestly, he probably was. Imagine the quiet, simmering tension at royal dinners. "Oh, do pass the salt, Lerma, before you, misplace it into your own coffers." The marriage produced 8 children, which, for a Habsburg, was a pretty decent haul. Among them was the future Philip IV, Charles II's father, remember him? And also Anne of Austria, who would become Queen of France. So, lots of little Habsburgs running around, ensuring that the family name and the family genes would continue their grand European tour. Despite his piety, or perhaps because of it, Philip III had some truly peculiar habits. He was famously obsessed with etiquette and royal protocol to an almost absurd degree. There's a rather famous, or infamous, story about how he supposedly died because of an excess of royal dignity. The story goes that he was sitting too close to a fireplace, felt himself getting too hot, but couldn't move because the designated official whose job it was to move the royal chair was not present. No one else dared to touch the king's chair, of course, so he just sat there, baking, until he became so ill he died a few weeks later. Now, whether this is entirely true or a delightful piece of court gossip, it certainly paints a vivid picture of a monarch whose priorities were, shall we say, unique. Imagine the scene. Your Majesty, you're quite literally on fire. Yes, but where is the grand royal chair mover? One simply cannot be moved by just anyone. Just a glorious testament to the bizarre world of royal protocol. His reign also saw some significant and often controversial events. One of the most notable was the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609. The Moriscos were descendants of the Muslim population who had converted to Christianity in Spain. Despite their conversion, they were often viewed with suspicion and hostility by the old Christian population. Philip III, driven by religious zeal and a desire for absolute Catholic uniformity, signed the decree for their expulsion. This was a massive undertaking, affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Imagine the logistical nightmare and the human tragedy. These were people who had lived in Spain for generations, speaking Spanish, practicing their faith, albeit a new one, suddenly told to pack up and leave. Many died during the forced migration, and the economic impact on Spain was severe, as the Moriscos were often skilled farmers and artisans. So, a pious act, perhaps, but one with devastating consequences. But, hey, at least everyone left in Spain was definitively Catholic, which for Philip probably counted as a win. The Duke of Lerma, as the king's favorite, continued to amass power and wealth throughout Philip's reign. He was a master of courtly maneuvering, maintaining his influence despite attempts by rivals to oust him. This, of course, led to accusations of corruption and nepotism, because why wouldn't it? When one man holds that much power without any real check, things tend to get a little flexible with the rules. Lerma's downfall, when it finally came, was a classic piece of court intrigue. He eventually fell out of favor. Not with Philip himself, but with the future King Philip IV and other powerful figures who saw him as an obstacle. He was eventually removed from power, but not before he managed to pull off a truly impressive feat of self-preservation. He became a cardinal. Yes, a cardinal. This granted him ecclesiastical immunity, protecting him from legal prosecution for his various misdeeds. Because, when you're a corrupt courtier, the best way to avoid accountability is to get some divine protection. It's almost genius in a slightly unholy way. Philip III's reign is often seen as a period of decline for Spain, not because of any catastrophic military defeats, but because of a lack of effective leadership at the top. While the empire remained vast, its internal structures were weakening, its economy was struggling, and its strategic direction was often muddled by the shifting influence of Lerma and other courtiers. Philip himself, focused on his piety and leisure, was often oblivious to these deeper problems, or perhaps just preferred not to duel with them. It was a slow, gentle drift into imperial mediocrity, overseen by a king who just wanted everyone to be, nice and Catholic. He died in 1621 at the relatively